World. We have two distinguished scholars which help us connecting to previous glimpses to terror management theory. For a long time, Neil Elchi, the president of the Ernest Becker Society, came to our meetings of Colloquium on Violence and Religion. I myself referred 2 years ago in Madrid to complementarity between terror management theory and mimetic theory. And Duncan Morrow was already a keynote speaker. He's our second speaker, 1994 in Wiesbaden, bringing back the legacy of Ruhlkaptein to Innsbruck. Our first speaker is Alexander Yendell, a sociologist and substitute professor at the Department of Sociology of Religion and Church at Leipzig University. Before, Yandel worked at Loughborough University, at the Cluster of Excellence, Religion and Politics at the University of Münster, as well as the University of Potsdam. He's currently working on a mixed methods project on urban violence and extremism in the city of Leipzig, on a project on social groups and religious identities in civil society, as well as on a project on the perception of Christian, Jews, Muslims, atheists in Switzerland. He's one of the authors of the Leipzig study on authoritarianism. His recent publications focus on explanations for the support of Pegida, Islamophobia, anti-Muslim sentiments in Europe, with special reference to Germany. We were really looking forward and happy when you accepted our invitation, and we are now looking forward to your paper, Anti-Immigrant Attitudes and Anti-Muslim Sentiments Through the Lens of Social Identity and Terror Management Theory, and some more, as you told me before. So welcome, and we are looking forward.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to this really excellent conference. I was really very amazed about this interdisciplinary approach, and I've learned a lot on this conference because I have to admit I'm not an expert on mimetic theory, but I hope I still can contribute a little bit to this conference. Yeah, I have to open my PowerPoint slides. Okay, yeah, one of my main research areas in the past 10 years actually were attitudes towards Muslims and towards Islam. And as Wolfgang Palava already mentioned, I will not only concentrate on two theories as I promised, I will concentrate on more than these two theories, because I spontaneously actually decided that after hearing a lot of talks and presentations here, that actually more than these two theories also have some contributions which are interesting also in the discussion on mimetic theory. Since 9/11, the derogation of Muslims and Islamophobia seem to be on the rise. At the same time, or recently, right-wing populist movements are on the rise, and the core of their identity policy is the recentering on traditional, often even so-called Christian values, in distinction to Islam, which is described as violent, sexist, and fanatic by right-wing populists. Right-wing populists create a we and the other, separate the world in friends and enemy. But the success of right-wing populist parties are also needs to be explained by society, therefore it does not surprise that in many countries that a lot of population surveys reveal that especially in Western European countries, people have a problem with Islam and Muslims. They, for instance, this is a new survey, it came out yesterday, the Religion Monitor 2019, Bertelsmann Religion Monitor, and my colleague and mentor Gerd Pickel analyzed the data. And you can see that in many countries, people do not believe that Islam fits in the Western world, and they even feel threatened by Islam. A lot of, here you can see also threatening by Judaism, and you can see that in many countries a lot of people feel threatened by both, but more by Islam. And the question I have is, why is this so? Why do people feel threatened by Islam, and why do they derogate Muslims and also immigrants? That's my key question, and particularly I'm interested in what role does national and religious identity and religiosity play regarding negative attitudes towards immigrants and Islam, and in what way does migration policy have an impact on attitudes towards immigrants? And yeah, my method is, and I'm sorry that I'm going to torture you this morning at 9 o'clock, is the statistical analysis of population surveys, which is theory-led, and some of these theories might even have similarities to mimetic theory. And usually I will analyze data of the Swiss Household Panel, the International Social Survey Program, and the Saxony Monitor, a study, a representative population study conducted in the state of Saxony in Germany. And there are many theories which can explain why people develop xenophobic attitudes. And I believe that a lot of these theories can explain these attitudes. There's not only one theory, and we need to explain these attitudes by complex theoretical models. One very prominent theory is the contact hypothesis, which implies that contact with members of an outgroup can reduce stereotypes. Susanne Rippel, as well as other social scientists, assume that simple contact has no preventative effect on the development of stereotypes. In fact, what matters is the type of contact. It's a difference whether one has contact to a colleague, to acquaintances, friends, or relatives. And under certain circumstances like same status, a cooperative activity, or private personal meetings, contacts can improve interpersonal attitudes between an in and an out group. Also, the knowledge about an out group can reduce stereotypes. What matters is the medium which communicates the knowledge about an out group. Important is whether the communication is believed to be authentic or not. Many studies reveal the relevance of the contact hypothesis. A problem, of course, is always the causal direction. It can also presume that people with a high level of tolerance are open and search for contacts with strangers, but the meta-analysis of Pettigrew and Trop actually finds out that that people who have non-optional contacts, involuntary contacts, actually really reduce their stereotypes. There's also the parasocial contact hypothesis, which assumes that indirect contacts can also affect the view on a strange perceived group. This especially applies to media, and regarding Islam, it has to be mentioned that the bad news on Islamist terror mostly shapes the views in a negative way. Another very prominent theory is the deprivation theory, especially in times of economic recession. Intolerance towards minorities is often discussed as a result of objective as well as relative social disadvantage. Within the competition on few social and economic resources, members of the majority population could be particularly prone to intolerance towards a competing minority. So there might also be a link to mimetic theory. Usually studies distinguish between individual deprivation, meaning that an individual feels deprived, collective deprivation, meaning, of course, that one thinks the own group, the own people of the same nationality, for instance, are deprived. And objective deprivation is usually measured by low income, redundancy, and there's also subjective or relative deprivation, the feeling that it's the feeling, not the objective deprivation, but the feeling that you receive less resources in relation to others, for instance, competing minorities. Another very prominent theory, and it's, I think, also particularly interesting, is the theory of the authoritarian personality. The authoritarian personality was actually first mentioned by the psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich, who wrote the Psychology of Fascism. And it became very prominent through Erich Fromm and Adorno's work. The authoritarian personality is a state of mind or attitude characterized by belief in absolute obedience or submission to one's own authority, as well as the administration of that belief through the oppression of one's subordinates. It usually applies to individuals who are known as viewed as having an authoritative, strict or oppressive personality towards subordinates. Authoritarian personalities support authoritarian leaders in order to gain some of their strength. The ego defense mechanism of projection, which we could also translate as scapegoating, occurs as indicated when that person avoids self-reference of the anxiety-producing id impulse by displaying them onto inferior minority groups in the given culture with associated beliefs that are highly evaluative and rigid. I would also add the defense mechanism of projective identification, which has been described by the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, which means that a person can actually project an own impulse on others by, for instance, aggressivity, by provoking somebody else. Not I am aggressive, the other person is aggressive, and I will do everything to provoke this other person to be important defense mechanism, which has been described in psychoanalysis. Additionally, part of the authoritarian set of mind is a cynical view of humanity and a need for power and toughness resulting from the anxieties produced by produced by perceived lapses in society's conventional norms. Other characteristics of this personality types are imaginative tendencies, a tendency to believe in mystic determination, and finally, an exaggerated concern with promiscuity. Based on this psychoanalytical concept, Adorno and his colleagues developed the F-scale in his book on authoritarian personality. The entire assumption was based on the fact that a common educational ideal existed which consisted of punishment, especially corporal punishment. Although the modern society has become more open and punishment in many countries is not allowed anymore and probably less practiced, there are other techniques of authoritarianism, also called secondary authoritarianism. Critical theories believe that even today people have to submit to constraints of pressure, for example, to the ones of neoliberalism. The core is that people do not have the opportunity to meet their own needs. Authoritarian aggression feeds itself from the deep-seated source of its own adaptation under these constraints. Those who cannot live their own life have to hate the lives of others. Today, people do not necessarily uncritically obey an authoritarian leader, at least not yet, or in some countries we can see this development again, but they identify with power and size, for instance, through the national economy and growth. For the German, for instance, for the Germans, the identification with the economic power is very important for their identity. This also applies to US Americans. A few studies have revealed this. In this context, the thoughts of psychoanalyst Arno Grun, who died in 2015, are also relevant. Arno Grun said, the development of humankind was based on solidarity and cooperation. Solidarity and cooperation again lead to empathy and compassion. Neoliberal societies which are based on competition rather on solidarity do not create empathy. And again, democracies without empathy and compassion do not function in the long run. In this context, there's also some interesting studies by a British psychiatrist called Henry Dix after the Second World War, who found out that members of the German Waffen-SS had a combination of a narcissistic and paranoid personality disorder. Yesterday we heard a lot of narcissism. I think that's very important, but we also do not have to forget that paranoia also plays a role, especially when it comes to scapegoating and or projection. In combination with the societal and economical context during the Weimar time, those personalities regressed on a more immature level and behaved antisocial and psychopathological. And after the Second World War, these personalities become normal citizens in a way that that narcissists have a tendency to adapt to their environment. And indeed, a new study we conducted at Leipzig University on politically motivated crimes reveals that narcissism is can explain politically motivated crimes, and again, narcissism is an important impact on narcissism has dysfunctional families. Another relevant theory is the integrant, and we also find out quite interesting that voters of the AfD often have narcissistic personality traits. In this study I conducted last year, it turned out that voters of the AfD had, on average, a higher need for admiration and are also more likely than others to be rivalrous. Yeah? This narcissistic instrument to measure narcissism had two dimensions, rivalry and admiration, and AfD voters had very high levels of this. Another relevant theory is the integrated threat theory. I'm not going too much into detail because I think I will not be on time, but this is also a relevant theory, especially because it argues or it differs between symbolic and existential threat. Yeah? Attitudes are shaped by feelings of threat, and they can be distinguished in symbolic and existential threat. Existential or realistic threat, when you are really threatened physically, and symbolic threat when you have the feeling that the values of your culture, for instance, are in danger by another culture which undermines your values. Another relevant theory is the social identity theory, which claims that all human beings strive for positive self-esteem. One way to achieve this is to identify with a social group or a so-called social in-group. This in-group can, for example, be a club, a religious or football club or whatever, a religious community, an ethnic group, or a nation. One way to increase self-esteem, besides idolizing the in-group, is to disparage other or foreign groups, so-called out-groups, which takes place under the motto, your own group must always be better than the other group. Thus, disparaging other nations, ethnicities, and religious communities may be linked to a strong identification with homeland and be expressed in national pride. It is especially those with a lower self-esteem that strive to belong to an in-group and to disparage other groups. Another relevant theory, which Wolfgang Palava already mentioned, is the terror management theory. It also argues on the social identity theory, but it also argues that each person has fears death and wishes immortality. And the social in-group represents these own values and worldviews, and a strong identification with this in-group, social in-group, which can be also a nation, culture, religious community. This promises immortality, because if you die, your nation, culture, religious community, etc., will still live along, and also your values and world values. Social psychological experiments on the terror management theory reveal that people are more prone to agree with military interventions and also derogate other cultures, nations, etc., if they are confronted with their death. So there is more or less a vicious circle, because it comes to a threat, for instance, a terrorist attack, and then people defend their own social in-group and cultural worldviews. This leads to intolerance towards different others, derogation of outgroups. This can also lead to hostile behavior, or violent behavior, and to a social conflict, and that again causes more existential threat. But there are also some buffers, for instance, high self-esteem or engagement in social in-groups, intercultural in-groups, and also belief in life after death and so on, can buffer this vicious circle. And there's also a link between religiosity and Islamophobia. Maybe I'm not going too much into detail, but there has been a long tradition in finding out in what way religiosity has an impact. And there were some studies from Alport and Ross which were not really good, because they distinguished between intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity. But this was not really fruitful, and one way I'm going to do it later is with the centrality of religion scale, and I will distinguish between personal religiosity and public religiosity. Personal religiosity could have a significant impact in that the more present the experience of transcendence is to something divine or a higher power, the more likely it is to develop a universalizing dynamic. This could happen in a way that the strength of personal religiosity is accompanied by the internalization of values of humanity, such as goodness and love to one's neighbor, which in turn promotes tolerance and openness. Also the kind of strength and the social religious identity, which basically is derived from the dimension public practice, should play a relevant role. If the relevance of the social relationship for the individual increases, it is to expect it that the dynamics play a role in the argumentation of the social identity theory. High levels of a social religious identity should go along with a stronger identification with the religious in-group, which has implications for the relationship and attitudes to the religious out-group. Several scenarios are imaginable. It is possible that a strong identification with the religious in-group is accompanied by the devaluation of religious out-group, especially if the social religious in-group promotes exclusivity. And a second scenario is also imaginable. It is also possible that the values of the religious in-group include a degree of openness, perhaps even a willingness to help other religious communities, and that is not exclusive on the whole, and which goes along with a higher level of tolerance. Okay, I don't have much time, but I will present you some data. This one is on Switzerland. And the key research question is, what explains negative attitudes towards Islam, and in which way does religiosity have an impact on attitudes towards Islam? Here I analyzed the data, representative data of the Swiss household panel conducted in 2015, and I only considered Swiss and non-Muslim respondents, and some of the theories I described can be operationalized in this data. First of all, we can see that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment is on a high level. In Switzerland, there are different surveys which reveal that people are have problems with Islam and Muslims, and even derogate Muslims. Here, this is the question: is what is your personal attitudes towards the following religion and worldviews? And here it is Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, and atheism. And you can see that particularly people have negative attitudes towards Islam. About 37% of the Swiss have negative answer in a negative way on this question. I'm going to leave out a few of the correlations, but one important correlation was the one of deprivation. You can see that there's no significant difference between unemployed and employed people, not really a difference or a correlation between the income, but there is an statistically relevant is the satisfaction with the financial situation. So those who feel satisfied with their financial situation, they are less likely to have negative views on Islam. Also, trust plays a role, the political position, and religion. You can see that it's especially evangelicals and also the non-religious who have negative views on Islam, whereas people with other religions or Catholics and Protestants do not have such negative views as the others, although they are also on a high level. When it comes to public religiosity, you can see that those people who attend church service more than others, they have less negative attitudes than those, for instance, who never attend church service. And when it comes to personal religiosity, you can see that there's a correlation between praying, meditation, belief in God and something divine, and feeling to be at one. So people who have high rates on these questions on religiosity, they usually have less negative views than people who have lower rates. Also, a strong factor is the national identity. So those for who a Swiss identity is very important, they are more likely to have negative views on Islam. So what I also did is I conducted a multivariate analysis. I know this is a bit complicated, but I will sum up the conclusion. It becomes clear in these regression models that religiosity plays a role in such a way that the affiliation to the large churches, Protestant and Catholic, has a positive effect on the attitudes towards Islam. This may be justified by the church focus on religious freedom and interreligious dialogue. However, this effect is very weak and less important than other aspects. The effect of public practice, church attendance, is also rather weak, in a way that churchgoers have slightly less negative views on Islam. When it comes to religiosity, personal religiosity is comparatively important. People with high levels of personal religiosity are more likely to have a positive attitude towards Islam. There are also other factors which play a role. The political attitude, of course, the more left-wing, the better the attitude. And trust also plays a role. And with regard to the theory of social identity, it is striking that those Swiss for whom the national identity is particularly important are more likely to rate Islam negatively. So this indicator of social identity theory is quite important. It can be stated that belonging to a religious community and also religious practice proves to be conducive to attitudes towards Islam, but a strong national identification tends to promote exclusivity. Religiosity, for instance, as in Switzerland, therefore has a predominantly bridge-building effect. Another regression model on, with the data of the Saxony monitor, which I also conducted, the dependent variable was that the question if people think that the immigration of Muslims should be prohibited. And here you can see, I will conclude it, that the results of this regression analysis demonstrate that anti-Muslim feelings in Saxony is caused by a combination of factors. Not relevant is the actual economic disadvantage, and more relevant are subjective and strongly emotional explanatory factors, by which is meant primarily fears and feelings of threat to one's own culture. Yeah, there's especially the symbolic threat is important, not the existential threat, not that people are feared of a terrorist attack, but they are those who have negative views on Muslims, they have the fear that their culture is undermined by others. And also authoritarian attitudes were also measured in this regression analysis, were taken into account, and authoritarian attitudes have a very, very strong, are a very strong factor which explain anti-Muslim attitudes. Maybe one last presentation of results. I wanted also to answer the question in what way migration policy plays a role, and there's based on the theory of social identity. I assume, in reference to Michael Herm and Cornelia Weins, that migration policy regarding citizenship regulations have an impact on the form of national identity. And that again correlates or has an impact on how we view others, immigrants, for instance. Yeah? In countries where the citizen regulations are focus or are on the principle of the jus sanguinis, or in like so-called guest worker countries like Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, at least into the 1990s, more because of this citizenship regulation, because of this jus sanguinis principle, a more ethnic identity develops, and the ethnic and because others. Immigrants, Muslims, for instance, can never be part of this social in-group. They are always labeled as an out-group and therefore are very likely to be derogated. But in those countries which have more a modern or a multicultural or maybe an assimilationist model of citizenship, in this stage a more civic political identity develops. And in this, so, which makes it possible that immigrants can belong to the social in-group. And in such a country, it is more likely that the predominant identity is a civic identity, and then again leads to better attitudes towards migrants. I just show one picture maybe. Here you can see a link between the support of the jus sanguinis principle in many countries. It was a question in the International Social Survey program. If people think that you need ancestors of the same nationality to become German, French, Romanian, etc. And a correlation to the MIPEX Naturalization Index. It's an index by EU experts who evaluate the migration policy. So the better the migration policy, the easier it is to naturalize immigrants, the less the people believe in the jus sanguinis principle. And I can also show that, especially in this chart, that in many countries the support of the jus sanguinis principle goes along with with negative attitudes of immigrants, and this is especially the case in East European countries. For instance, you can see on these charts, it's mainly East European countries where people support support the statement that immigrants take away jobs. And again, there in these countries, people often believe in the jus sanguinis principle. Okay. I will stop here, maybe 2 charts if possible, 2 slides. Final conclusion: in countries where the possibility of naturalization is estimated as rather negative, the support of the jus sanguinis principle is stronger than in those countries where they are estimated as rather positive. In countries in which people often support the jus sanguinis principle, the derogation of immigrants tends to be worse than in those where it is not widely supported. And my final conclusion is Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiments are especially emotionally shaped. People especially feel symbolically threatened. Not those who are economically deprived are threatened of Islam and Muslims. It is those who feel deprived. Religion, as well as intercultural and interreligious context, can have a bridge-building effect as long as people do not have religiously dogmatic views. And one of the key factors which explain anti-Muslim attitudes and negative attitudes to immigrants is an authoritarian set of minds with the aspect of projectivity or scapegoating, and a lack of empathy which has its roots in socialization processes of individuals. Thank you very much for paying attention, and I'm sorry that no, it's actually quite okay, 10 minutes only. Thank you very much.
Alexander, thank you very much for providing us some theoretical tools to understand the problems we face today, showing us also data and applying it to very interesting cases. As you are already used, we will discuss both lectures afterwards, and I'm going to introduce our second speaker of this morning, Duncan Morrow. He's a professor in politics and director of community engagement at Ulster University in Belfast. He has worked directly in the fields of conflict resolution, Northern Ireland politics, and the relationship between religion and politics, including a strong interest in prisons, the pathology of violence, policing, and criminal justice. He has a long history in the application of Girard's mimetic theory to violence, peace, and conflict. His current research focuses on these questions, especially concerning Northern Ireland's politics. He is a professor, he was politician, he's member of many commissions between 2000 and 2012. Duncan was chief executive of the Northern Ireland Community Relations Council. In 1998, he was appointed as a sentence review commissioner responsible for implementing the early release provisions of the Good Friday Agreement. We hear more often because of Brexit about that. And since 2002, he has been a Northern Ireland parole commissioner. Since 2018, he has been actively engaged in political and community efforts to Northern Ireland society away from paramilitarism. He's also a full-blown, long-time Girardian, a student of Royal Captain, a long-time friend of myself, so I'm very grateful that he accepted our invitation, and he will now apply mimetic theory to the question of identity and difference. His talk will be on the geography of difference in a world of undifferentiation. Duncan, thank you very much for coming, and we are looking forward to your always engaging and inspiring talks.
Good morning. It always sounds like your obituary, and you're actually there. But cut it in half and don't expect too much. That's all I can say to you. I suppose I should start mimetically with a bit of advice that I was given once, which I heard originally came from the Dalai Lama in relation to the Pope, where he said that when you meet a crowd, you should spend some time trying to get a sense of who the crowd is. And I have to say, you're a very rough-looking crowd this morning. I am delighted to be here. This is, for me personally, a really important event because it brings together so many different parts of my own life. I have been working with issues brought up in René Girard's work for the whole of my professional life, but more importantly, for the whole of my personal life. I suppose all that I have to offer here, really, is two things. First of all, the fact that for me, living where I am and talking about these things, the questions of what it means to be a scapegoat, what violence means, how we find our way out of it, whether there are any ways in which we can understand it that help us understand our own predicament, are not abstract questions. They're immediately real questions, not simply at the level of even politics, where they're very obvious, but actually in the daily lives of people who are having to live through these realities and make sense and act in them. And Rule Captain, who was, obviously his name has come forward already and died many years ago now, but he came to Northern Ireland having been inspired by the work of Girard to see, because he believed that essentially everything is a question of mimetic relationships. That mimetic relationship is not simply an abstract idea. It is a total change in how we understand ourselves. That we live, work, breathe in mimesis. And one of the problems of it entering the academy is it gets diluted into an idea, as opposed to understood as giving voice to or giving words to a reality in which every single person participates. And so the question for me has always been, how do we make sense of what is happening here to the realities which we face, and in them, in as far as Girard finds in Jesus and in the story of the Gospels, and built on the story of the Jewish people, both the mechanism for revealing the truth, but also the invitation to speak about how would we move forward in this situation. The question for me is twofold. One, how do we understand what we're living through? And two, how do we now, what might we begin to think about doing? So I'll try and speak to this from a number of angles. I only have half an hour. I probably will run out of time, and I'll do my best. So bear with me. I think that we can conclude, those of us who think in the Girardian way, that we have now entered in the world what he describes as a significant crisis of undifferentiation. The critical issue for Girard, of course, is that the reality of mimetic relationships means that unless we find a way to give each other space, to give each other room, that the mimesis of desire will bring us immediately and terribly into conflict. And therefore, the risk is not so much difference as the erosion of difference. And in the context of the erosion of difference, that we all are brought into increasing anxiety as we lose our sense of place. And that up until now, the second part of Girard's great discovery, our place, our identity, who we are, has been guaranteed by systems which are founded on the scapegoat mechanism. That the scapegoat mechanism underlies our security. That if we lose the scapegoat mechanism, we will lose ourselves. And that is a significant threat if it's right. Because in a world in which, as he says, Christianity has essentially begun to dissolve the capacity of the scapegoat mechanism to operate by making it visible, the significant threat is that in a world of undifferentiation, more and more we will not simply find ourselves in rivalry, we will lose our sense of identity, and that will itself escalate the crisis. All of which suggests to us that we need to take stock of what's going on. Everything that we saw yesterday, and even hearing more this morning, tells us that everything now is happening in the same time and place. Things which used to be different, time and space, no longer apply. Thomas Friedman in 2005, American business writer, says, "The world is flat," which is an amazing conclusion to reach 500 years after Columbus. But nevertheless, the outcome, what he's saying is not that the world is yet flattened, although we may be going there, but that relationships which were once different and hierarchical have all become even. Everybody and everything is involved in the same competition. The whole world can be accessed in a phone. Just this January, I went to Colombia and found myself listening in total surprise to people from the Amazon jungle who told me that in one generation they've moved from having had no technology to not being anymore able to keep their children together because they all have phones. The speed and the scale of it are simply gigantic. And the sense of loss of place, the way the world works, the order that we received, who we are within the world, being on the move, is almost at such a speed that it simply isn't possible anymore to have an overview of what's happening. But what is definitely true is in technology, in demography, in economies, in environment, in migration, in people's private lives, all of the signals are pointing in the same direction. And in the migration crisis, we find ourselves facing what Paul Dumichel and Wolfgang have outlined with extreme clarity is what they describe the destruction of territoriality. The idea that there's an outside and an inside. And territoriality, in Paul Dumichel's writing, is not simply a question of space, it's a question of our relationships to each other within space. That it is also a social concept, the concept of territory. And so if we want to talk about loss of place, no longer being able to look to culture to tell us who we are, then geography and time are beginning to dissolve. Assumptions about who is on top and who is below are changing. Issues about is there such a thing as male and female? Religion and territoriality. All of them are, as of this moment, in dispute in all of the countries of the Western world and increasingly across the globe. What Pankaj Mishra does so well in his books is demonstrate how quickly this is now spread right across the world. This is now a global phenomenon of considerable speed, and at a speed which nobody has any particular control over. And in the middle of this, we're starting to see all sorts of phenomena which might be described in some ways as a total crisis of identity, or maybe if we want to put it differently, a crisis of being. I live in Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland has always been outside the assumptions of territoriality. We have never been able to assume an identity. When people in Northern Ireland are talking politically, and this is not a joke, they don't even agree on the name. Some people regard Northern Ireland as a colonial expression and insist on calling it the North of Ireland. As a result, one of the ministers who came into our new government said to his civil servants, "I don't want you calling it Northern Ireland, and if you can't call it North of Ireland, just call it here." So even to the point of naming the place, this is a place in which it is extremely difficult to understand who are we within time and space. And I just at this point want to say to you two things. First of all, one of the consequences is not that identity disappears, but that people fight more and more desperately for their identity. The fighting for identity is not a sign that identity is secure. It is an absolute sign that identity is on the wane. Number two, the word identity in English, I'm sure, it is derived from the same word as identical, meaning the same as. In other words, the word identity says I find myself in something else. In other words, identity is always a relationship. And what is in crisis is always the relationship. It is not simply I who am in crisis, it is who I am in relation to other things. And as other things start to move, so I start to move. At the core of Girard is the assertion that we are not individual. Everything who we are, our entire self, is given to us in relationships. And so we need to pay attention to the fact that in a mimetic crisis of indifferentiation, it doesn't simply start and stop at the top. It becomes a very personal reality in the middle of political systems as the whole world starts to engage in a general mimetic crisis. And the general mimetic crisis is at every point likely in Northern Ireland affairs, is anything to go by, to heighten rather than to lessen the demand for greater identity security. And so at the same time as we see chaos, we see the rise of counter-chaos. But instead, Carl Schmitt always hoped, as Wolfgang has written so well, by creating an external enemy we would avoid this crisis. The problem now is that the enemies are within. In the absence of outside and inside, the enemies being within only creates more chaos. So every attempt to resolve the chaos by counter-chaos simply results in greater chaos. And that, in some sense, is the predicament we're in. To live in Northern Ireland, and I'll just talk a little bit about that, and not because it's important, but because it's my experience, is this. First of all, as the violence rises, people become more and more fascinated. They become less and less concerned about the wider world and more defining their identity only on one thing. So fascination rises. The second thing is that it's fought out in the smallest changes of symbol and ritual and myth. That the stories of who we are have to be told more firmly. That the rituals of who we are have to be told more firmly. And that the symbols of who we are and who they are not are more and more present rather than more and more absent. Further of all, it leads to every sorts of attempts at social segregation. And social segregation is a word for getting rid of the others. In other words, that the expulsion of the others has been absolutely part of our reality. If you come to Belfast, even now, 20 years into a peace process, the landscape of the city is marked by walls. Peace walls on which one side of the community live and the other side of the community live, in which there are physical manifestations of that division. Finally, it enters into the everyday. The everyday is meaning that people need to know, even in their personal relationships, who is who. We don't have visible difference. Visible difference, as we were talking about yesterday, or even oral difference in language, makes it clear who is and who is not different. In Northern Ireland, it is not even clear who and who is not different. So we have found our ways to make sure how we know who they are. They include, what is your name? At which point everybody knows what side is the other, or maybe not. Where do you live? That's another good bet. Where did you go to school? And what do you think football means? Because there are two kinds of football in Northern Ireland, Gaelic football and what the rest of the world calls football. So all of these things, ritual, facts, give people away. So identity becomes the fascinating centre, the unresolved crisis, and we agree on one thing. The source of the crisis is them. I am only this bad person because you make me so. I would not need my counter-terror if you were not a terrorist. I would not be a terrorist if you were not this oppressive person. But the consistent and only theme that goes through the whole lot is them. The consequence of a politics of them, a politics of the scapegoat, a politics of the other, as politics in which the other always appears to you first as suspicious, and therefore you cannot treat them. There is no rationality, except the rationality, as Paul Dumichel really well draws out. The only rationality that exists is the rationality of suspicion. It is reasonable for me to suspect you because, and I need to take precautions against you. I'll tell one story and then I'm going to stop talking about Northern Ireland. But the Unionists in Northern Ireland, that's the Protestants who were technically in charge, but very frightened, had a parliament which they could pass laws. And they passed this law, which in Northern Ireland was called the Special Powers Act. And it's a very simple law. It says, in an emergency, the state needs to do what it has to do when it has to do it. Number two, what it has to do when it has to. Number two, anybody who thinks that we can rely on normal law is clearly either an idiot or a traitor. And number three, we will have to have special people who are police who will go in and put in this law. That's what it says. That logic is now the logic of what is called Homeland Security. Normal law will not deal with these people. Anybody who thinks that it will is either stupid or a traitor, and we need to use special forces and special measures to do it. The entire world clearly reacts on exactly the same basis as the Ulster Unionists, who were a forerunner for the Globe. And the truth is, do you believe that when you put the police in to your enemy, that enemy is going to turn around and go, oh, well, maybe we made a mistake? No. Mimetically, what they do is say, this is clear, these people are as violent as we said, we must resist. And when they resist, do you believe that the people who put in the law say, oh, well, maybe we made a mistake there, we should have a little rational conversation with these people who are killing us, and maybe we'll stop? No, they do not. They say, we want more security. We want more security means more of the same. More of the same means more of the same. And what I will tell you is that we have only been held back by this by a geopolitical accident. But the truth is, there is no limit to this escalation once that starts. There is no limit to that escalation once that starts, except who wins. Okay, so I've said enough. I was going to talk about Brexit, but I've not got time. But Brexit, let me tell you, is an existential crisis for the United Kingdom on a phenomenal scale. What was once a simple question has escalated now up into a series of internal rivalries which are tearing the country apart, between Scotland and England, between one part of the Conservative Party and another, between a class issue, a generational issue, but at every level it has created crisis. And in Ireland, it has created even greater crisis, because the only political transcendence we found was when Britain and Ireland came together to make a compact whereby a new identity might be possible for us. And the Brexit discussion is the destruction of identity for us. And therefore, at that level, to be honest, is potentially, and why everybody's worried about it, is establishes new mimetic conditions of undifferentiation in which we once again go round our circle. So the fear is that's going to happen. So, I just want to say some things about how we understand this, and then I want to finish with some ideas. I suppose what I'm suggesting to you now is we're all beginning to live in a state of exception, in which resorting to normal ideas of law and order, normal ideas of resorting back to identity formation on the basis of the scapegoat are not going to work. They're simply not going to work. Every effort to enforce will create a counter-enforce. Every effort to counter-enforce will create another enforce, with the risk that this simply escalates up into a new standoff of violence, in which the dominant theme is violence. Number two, Girard, Wolfgang, Paul Dumichel have all talked about the issue of how, partly this is to do with the fact that every time violence is used, it is now visible. We know about the scapegoat. It is always true that people stand on that side, that it is not possible to use violence and find ourselves with the moment after the driving out of the scapegoat where we have our peace together. Instead, what we get is the scapegoats come back. And I suppose what I want to warn about is this is a very serious issue. In Europe, in the eastern part of this continent, when there was a crisis of undifferentiation in the mid-20th century, the consequences were gigantic. So I'm not here to threaten, in that sense, a particular apocalypse. What I am here to say is that I agree with Girard when he says that von Clausewitz is a better predictor of the future than Hegel. When he says that the escalation of this will not happen because we politically manage it. That the only possibility is, and here I suppose I want to say a few things, is that René, when he's writing, holds up the picture of Hölderlin as sitting outside. And his great line is, the only way out of this is refuser la revanche, to refuse revenge. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is, in a situation in Northern Ireland where it is extremely clear that political management is at best already fragile in a very small place like that, and secondly can be set aside by other events so quickly, my experience is, so what do we do in the middle